I am the Master of Ceremonies. And it's really a pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Professor Roberta White. Dr. Roberta White is a clinical psychologist and a neuropsychologist who chairs the Department of Environmental Health at Boston University School of Public Health and also serves as the Associate Dean for Research. She's the Scientific Director of the Research Advisory Committee, the RAC. I'm sure we'll hear that come up, the RAC. Research Advisory Committee for Gulf War Illnesses, and has spent over 30 years conducting research focused on the effects of environmental toxins on brain functions in adults and children. She was the main author of this landmark report affirming the exposure to toxic chemicals, including pesticides and pyridostigmide bromide, a drug used given to the troops to protect against nerve gas, and we believe it has affected thousands of veterans of the 1991 Gulf War. In addition, Professor White is a world-renowned researcher. She's a beloved teacher and mentor at Boston University, and on a personal note, a hell of a nice person.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be part of a conference addressing the health problems of veterans in recent decades. This has been a population that I've worked with extensively, and veterans are very dear to my heart, both as a clinician and as a scientist. I will have to say, and I'm not just being humble here. I'm not the lead author on the RAC report. The RAC report was done by the entire RAC, and the leader of the RAC, when we first started writing it, was Dr. Lee Steele from Kansas. So that's really a group effort. And while I was the scientific director when it was released, and I was very involved in calling attention to it, it was really a group effort. So this talk this morning I've given before, although often I just talk about the science. This morning I'm going to talk about the science and the politics that I've been involved with in 19 years of working with Gulf War veterans. So we're going to focus today on Gulf War illnesses. There are some diagnosed illnesses like ALS and brain tumors that have been associated with Gulf War service. I'm going to spend more time talking about what has been called, and I'm going to refute this terminology, I hope, effectively for you, unexplained illnesses or symptom-based illnesses in Gulf War veterans. As has already been mentioned, the Gulf War occurred in 1990 to 1991, starting with Operation Desert Shield and then going on to Operation Desert Storm. The troops won the war very quickly in February and returned after a cleanup phase in the spring. About 700,000 U.S. troops were deployed to the war, and there were also troops deployed from other countries. I'm going to talk about them a little bit too. When they returned from the war, within a couple of years, we knew that they had very significant health symptom complaints. These were considered at that time to be mysterious. And the notion of Gulf War syndrome was coined in the press and other places to describe these physical symptoms that the Gulf War veterans were complaining about. We also know that at least a quarter of the veterans were experiencing these health symptoms. The symptoms commonly reported are listed on this slide. Very prominent symptoms include fatigue, joint pain, headaches, rash and dermatitis, cognitive problems, and chronic diarrhea. Now, one thing about the symptoms that you should understand from the beginning is that not every veteran had exactly the same group of symptoms, and they did not have them to the same degree of severity, and that caused some issues as the research in this area unfolded. So first I'm going to talk about some science around the issue of Gulf War illnesses. I'm going to start with a brief history of what was done at the very outset right after the war, and then I'm going to go through a series of studies done here in Boston over the last 19 years on the issue of Gulf War illness. So the very earliest efforts that were put into place to approach the problem of Gulf War illness actually started before we knew there was anything happening with the Gulf War veterans. And that occurred at Fort Devens here in Massachusetts in 1991. Some people from the Boston VA, including a chaplain, Chaplain Marks, had the foresight to interview 3,000 troops, Army troops, when they returned from the war through Fort Devens within 2 weeks of their return. So while they were still at Fort Devens, they were interviewed and underwent some survey instruments. Now that effort in 1991 really focused mostly on post-traumatic stress disorder, the disorder that had received such prominence following the Vietnam War, but at the same time, a health symptom checklist was given, including 20 health symptoms, physical health symptoms that the veterans could respond to. So we were actually able to gather data on physical symptoms starting in 1991. And this Fort Devens cohort of 3,000 people turned out to be very important in the Gulf War illness story. I'm going to talk about the clinical studies in a minute. A little later than this, in the early to mid-90s, Ross Perot gave Robert Haley at University of Texas Southwest a lot of money to try to solve the Gulf War illness problem quickly. Dr. Haley did a bunch of studies on CBs, which he published fairly quickly in JAMA, describing some syndromes that he thought were associated with Gulf War illness. Around the same time as Dr. Haley was doing his work, the VA decided that maybe they should commit some resources and focused energy on looking at the Gulf War problem, and they decided to fund some centers that they called Environmental Hazards Research Centers, or EHRCs. A request for proposals went out. These were program project or center type research efforts that they were funding at considerable funding levels. About 20 proposals came in, and 3 environmental hazard centers were funded, one in Portland, Oregon, one in New Jersey at Rutgers, and one here in Boston that was a collaborative effort of Boston University School of Public Health and the Jamaica Plain VA. These 3 centers took really different approaches to the Gulf War illness problem. In Portland, they tried to look at cases of Gulf War illness and controls. In New Jersey, the Gulf War illness problem was likened to multiple chemical sensitivity or chronic fatigue syndrome. In Boston, we tried to look at the relationships between exposures experienced in the Gulf and health problems. So I'm going to go through the Boston effort a little bit right now. I know this effort the best, but also I think it's the single longest sustained effort at Gulf War illness research anywhere in the country or the world. So I mentioned the Fort Devens survey that was done in 1991. In 1993, a very interesting thing happened. The VA central office called our VA. I was at that time at the Boston VA. I had a joint appointment between the VA and BU School of Medicine, and told us that the veterans were coming back with these strange symptoms. They didn't understand them. Did we think they were post-traumatic stress disorder, or did we think maybe it was something else? And they called both Jessica Wolf of the National Center, who was at that time at the National Center for PTSD at the Jamaica Plain VA, and myself as a person who had worked on effects of chemical exposures. So what we did was to start studying some of the Devens cohort members very intensively. And we did this strictly at that time through clinical funding from the VA. The first thing we found was that Gulf War illness cannot be explained by post-traumatic stress disorder. We knew this back in 1993, the reason being that diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder was far lower, something like 5 to 10% in our veterans than the 25% incidence of Gulf War prevalence of Gulf War illness. Now, since the formation of the Boston Environmental Hazard Center in 1994, there has been a huge series of studies done. In the slides that I'm going to go through now, you'll see the studies listed and some of the things we looked at. Rather than describing the studies in detail, I'm just going to tell you mostly what we found. So you can look at the slides and see a little bit about what we did, and then I'll tell you about what we found. So in the first several years of this research, we looked extensively at different possible diagnostic outcomes as well as health and brain function in our Gulf War illness sample from the Devens cohort, as well as a control group that was a National Guard unit that had been deployed during the Gulf War, but only as far as Germany. What we found in these initial studies right off the bat was that Gulf War illness is not multiple chemical sensitivity, it's not chronic fatigue syndrome, and it's not fibromyalgia. Now, obviously, based on those symptoms I showed you, there are overlaps. So Gulf War veterans complain of sensitivity to chemicals, they complain of fatigue, and they often have muscle and joint pain. But when you use the strict criteria that are applied to diagnosing these kinds of illnesses in people, most of our Gulf War veterans did not meet those diagnostic criteria. Furthermore, we tried to look at stress as a predictor of Gulf War illness and prominent health symptom complaints and neuropsychological dysfunction in a whole lot of ways. We looked at combat stress quantitatively. We looked at deployment-related stress quantitatively. We looked at symptoms of PTSD quantitatively, and these things did not predict occurrence of Gulf War illness. As I mentioned, we were also very interested in the chemical exposures that occurred during the Gulf War. The Gulf War is often referred to as a chemical war, and when the veterans came back, they really thought of it in that way. Some of the chemicals of importance during the Gulf War are listed on this slide. As those of you who are old enough to remember the war will remember, there were these oil well fires that were set, and there was dense smoke throughout the region during the war, causing exposure to particulate matter, actually at a rate higher than even in the London fog. There were also nerve gas agents exposures during the Gulf War to some nerve weapons called sarin and cyclosarin. And even a few people, as you'll hear this morning, exposed to mustard gas. Pyridostigmine bromide, or PB, was also given to the troops. These are pills that are acetylcholinesterase inhibitors. They were given to the troops kind of experimentally in the hopes that if Saddam Hussein used nerve gas agents, the pills would protect the troops from the effects of the nerve gas agents. Unfortunately, PB works for mustard gas, but not for sarin, which turned out to be the agent used in the war. And actually, George testified before the Senate about this little mix-up as well. In addition, the troops were exposed extensively to pesticides that we know are poisonous, including carbamates and organophosphates, as well as DEET. They also received some experimental vaccines and were exposed to a number of other kinds of chemicals. Going back to the exposures, early on we had no quantified measures of how much of any of these exposures people received. So we didn't know how many PB pills any one soldier got. We didn't know we didn't have any modeling of the oil well fire exposures. We didn't know how much nerve gas agent exposure people got. But we asked people about their exposures, and we started out by looking at the relationship between self-reported exposures and various health outcomes. And our earliest findings showed us that when people talked extensively about exposures to pesticides and nerve gas agents, The people with high exposures to these kinds of chemicals performed worse on neuropsychological tests, and they also had more health symptom complaints than people with low exposures to these chemicals. So early on, we identified pesticides and nerve gas agents as problematic. As our research continued, we started looking at treatment seekers, people who we thought would be the sickest of the sick, in studying these treatment seekers, we realized that the mixture of pyridostigmine bromide pills and exposure to pesticides was probably especially problematic in terms of health symptoms and neuropsychological test function. We also received funding from the Centers for Disease Control, through which we did some neuroimaging research on the Gulf War veterans. That research ended up showing us that there was a relationship between exposure to sarin and cyclosarin in a certain area in Iraq that I'll talk about in a minute called Qamishiyya, and objective evidence of structural brain damage in exposed veterans. We also did a study with the Danish Gulf War veteran cohort. That study showed, again, excess health complaints compared to military controls in the Danish soldiers that went to the Gulf, and this was linked, again, to pesticide exposure. Their uniforms, like ours, were treated with pesticides, especially their socks. As the work kept going on, we saw the treatment seekers again and found that the health symptom complaints and neuropsychological dysfunction that we had identified were chronic. They weren't getting a lot worse, but they weren't getting any better in terms of these problems. We also started research on pesticide applicators. These are veterans who, during the Gulf War, applied pesticides in theater. And what was great about the pesticide applicators was that we had information on how much pesticide and which pesticides and how much pyridostigmine bromide these guys were exposed to. Again, the signal from this study showed us that pyridostigmine bromide and pesticide exposure were very important in determining brain dysfunction and health problems. We also carried out a study funded by the VA in which we looked at brain imaging, MRI imaging, in ill Gulf War veterans high with symptom complaints, comparing them to healthy Gulf War veterans. And we found a difference, structural brain differences between the high symptom complainers and the low symptom complainers. Forgive me for putting up a slide of the brain. I can never help myself since that's my organ of interest. These red spots on this slide show interruption of white matter tracts or brain tracts in the brains of high symptom Gulf War veterans. So all those red spots that you see show pathological differences between healthy and ill veterans. We felt that this was kind of a really key indicator that there is a physical component to Gulf War illness. Okay, so that's my little review of some of the science. There's much more science on autoimmune function, on GI system function, on coagulopathies and blood dyscrasias that's been carried out in Gulf War veterans at other sites. That research is summarized in the RAC report that I'm going to talk about, and I'll be bringing it in at the end to my conclusions about Gulf War illness. But I hope what I've presented so far convinces you that there is something physical, something objective, and something exposure-related going on with this population. So to turn to the politics of this issue, what was going on in our society, in our bureaucracies at the time the veterans came back. Unfortunately, very early on, when the symptom complaints came out and when the whole issue of Gulf War illness or Gulf War syndrome became prominent, VA and DOD staff and physicians wrote papers and made public statements saying this is, quote, just I don't know how Michael would feel about this, post-traumatic stress disorder. It's caused by psychiatric disorders in the Gulf War veterans. It's caused by some kind of stress, poorly defined, possibly combat stress or deployment-related stress. And my favorite paper of all, this happens in all wars, so there can't be a physical problem here. There were two major sequelae of these kinds of claims from VA and DoD. One was that they really pissed off the Gulf War veterans, as you can imagine, who were suffering from physical symptomatology. They also, unfortunately, I think some of the people who wrote these papers, before the research that I just described was even carried out, became entrenched in certain opinions about what Gulf War illness was, and as the research began to unfold, they could not let go of those initial opinions about what Gulf War illness is. So to this day, most of those people think it's a psychiatric disorder. Also, in the early 90s, although the Gulf War veterans were telling us that there was nerve gas agent exposure in the war, they were also telling us that these chemical detectors that they were wearing were going off, indicating that they were around nerve gas agents. The Pentagon was denying that there was any nerve gas agent exposure in the Gulf War. Finally, in 1996, the Department of Defense admitted that an incident had occurred in a place called Qamishiyah, Iraq. This was a weapons depot of the Iraqis that we blew up. And when we blew it up, we exposed our own troops to sarin and cyclosarin, two nerve gas agents. At least 100,000 troops were in the area of the detonation of this depot, and the DoD finally had to admit that this occurred, and they started characterizing, quantifying, modeling the amount of nerve gas agent exposure that they thought various veterans had. Another issue that was going on at VA and DoD during the time of this research was that of health benefits and compensation to Gulf War veterans for their health symptoms. I remember the first meeting that I went to in Washington about the issue at VA Central Office about the issue of what kind of compensation should Gulf War veterans receive and what should it be for. I was arguing in favor of believing veterans and compensating them if they were disabled. I felt that if their health symptoms were denied and if certain very stringent kinds of diagnostic criteria were applied at this time, that this would be bad for the health of the veterans and it would also be a stupid thing to do. However, my voice had little sway. And the issue of benefits to Gulf War veterans for their health problems has been a very significant one. Paul Sullivan's going to talk about that in detail for you. At the same time, VA was also asking the Institute of Medicine to review at several points in time the issue of Gulf War illness and health complaints among Gulf War veterans. Several reports came out over time. I think there's a couple of important things about these Institute of Medicine reviews. One of them is that the National Research Council committees that work as part of Institute of Medicine were given very specific instructions by the VA on what they could look at in terms of the research on Gulf War illness and which evidence was acceptable. So these kinds of instructions from the VA, I think, really put boundaries around what the Institute of Medicine could look at and what could be seen in the reports. The most important research, the most important report that came out a few years ago to the detriment of Gulf War veterans was the 206 Institute of Medicine report that concluded that there was no unique set of syndromes or health symptoms common to Gulf War veterans, with a strong emphasis on a psychiatric explanation of health problems amongst Gulf War veterans. The issue of no unique syndrome was very controversial. I don't know any illness where everyone has exactly the same symptoms, and that seemed to be the requirement that they were imposing in order to conclude that there might be an illness associated with Gulf War service. At the same time, there were other activities going on at the governmental level. President Clinton organized a presidential advisory committee on Gulf War illness that reviewed Gulf War illness science. There was a federal interagency committee on Gulf War-related illnesses. This was a committee of VA and DoD staffers and scientists that talked, I think we talked monthly about Gulf War veterans' research and problems and what direction it should go in. This was a very dispiriting experience for me because many of the VA staffers involved in this committee fervently believed that the Gulf War veterans were exaggerating their symptoms, and I think that affected the outcome in terms of research and so on for Gulf War illness research. At the same time, the Senate and Congress were holding hearings over all of these years about Gulf War illness, resulting in 1998 in a law establishing the Research Advisory Committee on Gulf War Illnesses, or the RAC. Although the RAC was established in 1998 with the purpose defined in legislation to oversee and review the VA research effort on Gulf War illness, it did not actually get up and going until 2002 when George Bush appointed Jim Binns as director of the RAC. Jim's been director ever since then. This is a voluntary position. Jim is a Vietnam vet and attorney and businessman who, since his appointment to the RAC, has worked tirelessly on the issue of Gulf War veterans' health problems. The RAC meets 3 times a year, and at each of its meetings, which lasts about a day and a half, it reviews Gulf War illness research with an eye toward where should we be going with it? What have we found? What should we do next? It's had 3 scientific directors, Beatrice Galome, Dr. Lee Steele, who I mentioned earlier, and I'm the current scientific director. And it has published a number of reports summarizing what it has found in its meetings over the years. The report that Dean Meenan mentioned is that the 2008 RAC report was the most influential report we've produced. It's several hundred pages long. And it concludes that Gulf War illness is real, it's not post-traumatic distress, and it's not a psychiatric disorder. The health symptoms in Gulf War veterans occur in excess relative to virtually all control groups studied and research conducted in multiple countries. And Gulf War illness meets criteria for a syndrome. That is, it has a specific cause, a specific set of candidate symptoms, and it occurs in a specific population. Other key findings in the RAC report were that Gulf War illness is related to exposure to chemicals that inhibit the formation of acetylcholinesterase in the brain. This is a neurotransmitter in the brain. Those acetylcholinesterase inhibitors of importance in the Gulf War are chemicals that I've already talked to you about: pyridostigmine bromide, the pesticides in the organophosphate and carbamate family, and the nerve gas agent sarin. At the time of our 2008 report, we weren't sure about whether sarin was a contributor or not. I think we've pretty much since then concluded that it was. Not all the research had been completed at that time. This whole research effort is sort of like Agent Orange in Vietnam. It seems to be taking decades to figure these things out. The report also concluded that specific body systems are affected in Gulf War illness, including the central nervous system, the autonomic nervous system, the immune system, and the gastrointestinal system. In addition, certain clinical diagnoses are associated with Gulf War illness, including amyotrophic lateral sclerosis or Lou Gehrig's disease and brain tumors. Most importantly, we concluded that treatment trials are needed. 2 treatment trials were done early on by the VA, one using cognitive therapy, one using antibiotics. These treatments were not effective for Gulf War illness. The RAC report, I think, was very important because it received a lot of media attention. The day that it was released, Jim Binns was interviewed by Jim Lehrer for 30 minutes, or he was not interviewed by Jim Lehrer. He was on the Lehrer report for 30 minutes. NPR interviewed me, and that interview was broadcast nationally. There were dozens and dozens and dozens of articles in the print media saying that Gulf War illness is real. There were many editorials in newspapers saying we need to take Gulf War veterans' health complaints seriously and do something about compensating and treating them. We released the report initially on the BU website and received 600,000 hits in the first 3 weeks after we released it, looking at that website. I think 2008 marks a very important time in the history of Gulf War illness research. I think that was the year in which people in general, the public in general, started believing that Gulf War illness was real, that it was serious, and that Gulf War veterans deserved attention, treatment, and compensation. How did the VA, and I'm not sure it was because of the RAC report. I think maybe the tide of opinion was happening, and then the report came out at the same time, and there was just a wave of, oh my gosh, we have to really take this seriously. Unfortunately, 2008, you'll remember, is 17 years after the war. The VA's response to the RAC report was initially quite muted. Secretary Pike was the secretary for the VA at the time. However, they then released some statements saying that Gulf War illness is not a unique syndrome and commissioned a new Institute of Medicine report. Veterans on both the individual and organizational level had quite a vocal response to the report and used it to advocate for and further their needs. And the report, of course, set off a whole bunch of hearings in the House and Senate that a number of us who are here this morning testified in. At the same time all of this was going on, of course, things were happening in other countries. In the United Kingdom, the Gulf War illness research effort was led by a psychiatrist named Simon Wesley, who very firmly believed that it was a psychiatric illness, and that seemed to be the prominent message in the UK. However, at the same time, in the House of Lords, 3 people, Lords Alfred Morris, Craig, and Lloyd, were working on behalf of Gulf War veterans. Craig was the commander of the United Kingdom forces in the Gulf War, the equivalent of our Colin Powell. He believed that Gulf War illness was a real and serious problem because he saw his troops get sick, people that he had known who were very healthy, strong warriors who became ill after the war, and he did not think that this could be an accident. Lord Morris is a very interesting guy. His father was exposed to nerve gas agents, to mustard in World War I, and was disabled, never compensated. When he was elected to Parliament in the UK, he became an advocate for people with disabilities and was the first secretary for disabled people in the UK. Lord Lloyd actually sponsored a report on Gulf War illnesses that came out in the UK. And several symposia were held in the United Kingdom in the House of Lords around the Gulf War illness problem. Here's one of them. The last one was in 2009 in the Queen's Robing Room. However, for both the UK and Australia and a number of other countries, they've really followed the lead of the United States because we've done the most research. All right, I mentioned that the VA commissioned another Institute of Medicine report after the RAC report came out in 2008. This report came out in 2009. Although the committee was told to look at diagnosed illnesses, not multi-symptom illness or health complaints, they looked at multi-symptom illnesses anyway and concluded that multi-symptom illness is associated with Gulf War illness, and that excess health complaints or problems are seen in Gulf War veterans compared to all tested control groups in all of the countries in which this has been studied. They also had a section concluding that PTSD and psychiatric disorders were important. They did not feel that there was sufficient evidence using their criteria to conclude that there was a chemical causation for Gulf War illness. The important thing about this report, I think, is that the media response to it again emphasized the physical nature of Gulf War illness and the fact that it's real. So what is Gulf War illness, you may ask? I'm going to give you my answer. I think after 19 years of studying it, that it's a chemically induced occupational disease. Working in occupational clinics, as I have, and environmental health clinics in my career, I would call it an intoxication caused by exposures to a mixture of acetylcholinesterase inhibiting chemicals, including pesticides, PB, and nerve gas agents. Of course, the mixtures experienced by different veterans were different, and their symptoms are somewhat different. I think it's a complex disease. I don't think we yet understand the mechanisms of effect, but I think it's a neuroinflammatory and or an autoimmune cascade with neurological, GI, dermatological, and hematologic consequences. There are many important unanswered questions about Gulf War illness. These include how should it be treated? Does treatment just have to be palliative, or can we cure it? Can we develop a definitive diagnostic test or tests for Gulf War illness? Should there be a clear case definition of Gulf War illness? Should it be something called chronic multi-symptom illness, which is a diagnosis that CDC developed for the disorder, which requires 3 different kinds of symptoms at 3 different levels of severity? That diagnostic definition is so broad that it applies to lots of people who weren't in the Gulf War. Can we better define the mechanisms of causes of Gulf War illness? And what are the genetic factors that are involved in Gulf War illness? Clearly, everyone had similar exposures, but only 25% of the Gulf War veterans became ill. There's probably a susceptibility factor going on here. And there's, of course, a lot of controversy that I'm sure George could enlarge on what you do when you start looking at genetic variability. Okay, so what's happening at VA now? Since Secretary Shinseki was appointed after President Obama was elected, the VA has been reviewing its Gulf War illness program. Shinseki's top aide is a man named John Gingrich, who's a Gulf War veteran. He's been very influential in guiding the VA in reviewing its Gulf War illness program. This has resulted in some VA reports on their research effort around Gulf War illness, their clinical approach to evaluating and treating Gulf War veterans, the guidelines that they were using at VA for physicians in the field treating Gulf War veterans were quite primitive, and some recommendations about revising those have been made. And there have been promises for greater compensation for treatment of veterans with Gulf War illness. The funding for Gulf War illness research really dropped at the early turn of the decade in around 2000 to 2005. It has since increased somewhat. The Department of Defense, through its CDMRP program, now allocates about $8 million a year for this research. Congress actually earmarked $15 million a year for 5 years for Gulf War illness research. This money was first awarded to the University of Texas Southwest, but is now being managed by VA at central office, and we're waiting to see how that's going to work out. VA also has other funding of Gulf War illness research projects totaling, they say, around $5 million. The focus of Gulf War illness research right now is felt to be most important in terms of treatment trials and integrated approaches to trying to answer those questions I listed about Gulf War illness. We know a lot about Gulf War illness now. It's time to really focus in and solve the problem. When we started, back when I was saying, how much pesticide were you exposed to and which ones, and do you think you were exposed to nerve gas agents, we're a long way from that time. It's time to grab the bull by the horns and solve this problem. I think we have all the cues, the keys, the money's there. So this is kind of a make it or break it time as far as I'm concerned in Gulf War illness research. So what have I learned from the 19 years of involvement in this that's important? First of all, I always thought this, but I'm going to repeat it. You have to listen to people when they're ill and take them seriously. I think we would have gone much faster. We would have solved problems related to Gulf War illness much more quickly, and we would have entered treatment trials over a decade or more ago, had we really listened to the Gulf War veterans. The Institute of Medicine and reports are very important. The Institute of Medicine is our kind of arbiter of science in the United States, but what they can say and how they say it is limited by the questions put to them and their own rules about how they talk about causation. And I think it's important to keep that in mind when we use these reports in the political arena. The power of personal experience of politicians and military commanders just came to me over and over again. John Gingrich, Lord Craig, various people who were involved in the war, who knew veterans, who were healthy when they went to war and sick when they came back, have been very important in keeping this issue alive. I think it could have died, but they've kept it alive. Determined advocacy, despite the many, many years of that this issue has been unfolding, has been very important in getting us to the point where we almost have some solutions, and in calling for treatment trials. Congressional input has been very important. The media has, of course, been important, and I think has helped turn the tide of public opinion around this. And when public opinion changed, funding went up again, and the calls for treatment trials became more important. That's the end of what I'm going to say. I'll be interested in the discussion about it. I would like to dedicate this talk to Gulf War veterans from all countries, including the ones that are with us today, and to my father, who was a veteran of World War II in Korea and died as a result of his service in Korea. Thank you.